This wasn't just any disappearance. It was a case that baffled investigators and sent shockwaves through the city. Budnytska, a 21-year-old woman, vanished without a trace, only to be found days later, dumped on the Everglades, 8 miles from her hotel, beaten and... Hello everyone! In this video, we will be covering the case of how a woman who was left for dead solved 3 other assault cases. This is the story of the suitcase. In 2005, on a winter morning around 8:30 a.m., a power company worker was driving on a suburban road heading towards the Everglades. He spotted an unconscious woman with her face down in the weeds. The woman had long, pretty blonde hair. It was clear that she was naked, wet and cold. As he approached the women, he was astonished to find that she was alive, unconscious but breathing. He immediately contacted the police, and soon after she was airlifted by police to Jackson Memorial Hospital. When she regained consciousness in the trauma center, her memories of the ordeal were hazy, but her injuries told a grim story. She had been beaten and left for dead. She had severe head trauma, and the bones around her right eye were shattered. The doctor was able to obtain semen as evidence. Due to her injury, she could not speak, but she was able to write down her name. Budnytska. She worked at a cruise line company in Miami. Ina had a pending lawsuit against the cruise ship due to her sustaining an injury while working there. One of the first things she requested upon waking was her lawyer. This surprised detectives because it was unusual. They thought she could be making up the assault to sue the hotel, since she already had a pending lawsuit with the cruise line she worked at. Investigators discovered that she had been staying at the airport Regency Hotel for months. A cruise line had arranged her stay while she recovered from a work-related injury. On February 21st, Ina claimed the assault began in her hotel room on the 4th floor. She recalled the attacker to be 2 or 3 white men, possibly Hispanic. Her memories came in fragments. She remembered being smothered with a pillow, forced to drink something, carried over a man's shoulder, and assaulted in the back seat of a car. Unfortunately, these snippets from her memory offered no solid leads. When her lawyer filed a lawsuit against the hotel for negligence, detectives grew suspicious, thinking it could have been a lawsuit scam since her stories were inconsistent and they couldn't find any evidence of the men she was talking about. Detectives combed through her room for evidence, interviewed staff, reviewed guest lists, and examined surveillance footage. There was more than 174 rooms, and the police lacked the resources for a comprehensive investigation for all the foot traffic. After weeks without progress, case was cold. The focus shifted to civil court. The hotel's legal team hired private investigator Ken Brennan to uncover the truth. He reviewed the crime scene photos, tapes of the 16 surveillance cameras, and Ina's confused statements. Ina's memory was clearly unreliable. She stated she was attacked by 1 man, then 3, then 2. She said their accent might have been Romanian and not Hispanic. Ken started with the hotel's security. The hotel had many cameras, and it was well fenced with back gates that were always locked and monitored. There were always 2 security guards on duty at all times. Additionally, cameras were pointing at each exit. All guests' digital key cards are recorded every time they leave their rooms. This allowed for hotel to have records of every guest leaving. Next, Ken started with what was indisputable. Ina was wearing a bright red jacket with black pants. That night, she went to grab dinner with a friend at the Coconut Grove and returned at midnight alone. She went to the lobby to chat with the staff and guests. Security camera shows Ina exiting the elevator at 3:33 a.m. to buy a phone card. She wanted to call her mum in Ukraine because this was around 11 a.m. in Ukraine. The lobby camera showed her re-entering the hotel and elevator, and there was a large black man who followed her. They exchanged a few words and she entered her room. Ken established that about 7 minutes later, Inna entered her fourth-floor room at 3:41 a.m. Inna was not seen again after that. The problem was clear. There was no footage of her leaving the hotel. The surveillance cameras were motion-activated. The detectives had tested the surveillance system extensively by moving very slowly or coming from an angle that the camera would not see. Fortunately, the camera was able to detect everything, meaning it should have caught Inna leaving. They consider that she may have been lowered out through the fourth-floor window. She was unconscious and lowered to the bushes below. The attackers exited the hotel, walked around, and picked her up. This was ruled out because the bushes did not look trampled on, and Inna didn't have any injury from the rope or the drop. Ken ruled out this scenario, concluding that she had to have exited through the front door. Ken reviewed the footage of that night and accounted for every individual entering and leaving the hotel. Keycard records, camera footage, and parking lot activity were analyzed. Ken eliminated guests who had left and did not return before Inna was last seen re-entering her room. He also eliminated people who entered the hotel and were not seen leaving. Anyone who left before her final elevator trip or stayed in their room throughout the timeline was ruled out. A potential suspect was George Perez. He was the hotel manager that night and had access to all the rooms. He was seen speaking with Inna many times at the front desk that night. Around 2:16 a.m., Perez was seen leaving the front desk and went into the elevator with Inna. The desk was unattended for about 15 minutes. He returned alone. When questioned, Perez said that Inna asked him to help her to her room because she was intoxicated. Perez volunteered for his DNA to be collected. Perez's DNA was not a match. There was only one person left who was suspicious. It was the man who entered the elevator behind Inna. He was about 6'4" and over 300 pounds with glasses. Inna exchanged a few words with the man. Later, around 5:28 a.m., the same man was seen in the lobby pulling a suitcase to the parking lot. He then returns to the hotel about an hour later without the suitcase. This left detectives questioning why a man would bring their suitcase out to their car so early in the morning when he was not planning to check out. Why bring a suitcase just to return an hour later without it? Could Inna be in that suitcase? But the suitcase looked so tiny, almost like the size of an overhead carry-on. A woman couldn't possibly fit in it. Ken suspected that maybe since the man was so big, it made the suitcase look small. After studying the video of the man exiting the elevator, Ken referenced the side doors and realized that the suitcase could fit women if they were curled up. Another interesting moment was when he had to give the suitcase a tug to get the wheels unstuck between the space of the elevator floor and the ground floor. That bag must have been quite heavy for a big man like him to need both hands to tug the suitcase. His demeanor was composed. It's like he was taking a casual stroll. Usually, first-timers who do this sort of thing would be shaking, jittery, and anxious. They would leave the scene and not walk back to the same hotel so nonchalantly. It was pretty clear that if this was the attacker, it was not his first time. He reviewed one of the videos showing that man was walking with a fit black man who wore a T-shirt with the word Mercury. They seemed like friends based on how they interacted. They were walking in the direction of a restaurant. Ken scoured the nearby restaurant surveillance camera and found a clip of the two entering a restaurant. The man with the white T-shirt had an ID tag on a string around his neck. The quality of the surveillance camera made it difficult to read what was on that tag. Ken reached out to NASA, but they could not help. Ken reviewed the footage again, and for a split second, he saw a word starting with the letter V and end with an O. Although the video was pixelated, he could make out the word Verado. With a quick Google search, Ken found that Verado was a new outboard engine model made by Mercury Marine. There had been a big boat show around the time of the incident. Ken concluded that maybe the man in the white t-shirt was working for Mercury Marine, and the 6-foot man was too. Ken called Mercury Marine and asked if they had their staff stay at the same airport as Inna because of the boat show. This would allow Ken to get the name of the man who followed Inna. Unfortunately, after checking, their staff stayed at a different hotel. They said only employees at the boat show's food court have those shirts. Ken contacted Centerplate, the company that was in charge of the food court. They specialize in servicing large sporting events and conventions. Unfortunately, it would be difficult to track one person because the company was massive and they employed people all over the country. But Ken wanted to try anyways and called the human resource at Centerplate. Fortunately, they told Ken that some of their staff was staying at the same hotel as Inna. But they had over 200 staff, and again the staff was from different parts of the country. Ken said, "Somebody has to remember a big black guy, 300 pounds at least, in glasses," which is true. He surely would stand out like a sore thumb. A week late, Centerplate called back after asking their staff if they remembered a big black man with glasses, and they did. One of the staff came forward and said that they remembered Centerplate hired the man to work at Zephyr Field, which is a minor league baseball team. Ken called Zephyr Field and finally struck gold. The staff said that they know who the guy is and his name is Mike Jones. But this is a common name. It would be incredibly difficult to find the real Mike Jones. Additionally, he doesn't work there anymore and no one knows where he went. Ken is close, he can feel it. The next logical thing to do was to see if there's a Mike Jones who stayed at the Regency around the time of the assault. Ken looked through the Regency's database and there he found it, a Mike Jones staying on the night of the assault. It showed that he checked in on February 14th and on February 21st he was seen rolling his suitcase, but his checkout date was February 22nd. This was unusual because who brings their suitcase to the car the day before they check out? Normally, you still need the things in your suitcase before checking out. Luckily, Mike used his Visa card and Ken got Mike's full name: Michael Lee Jones. The address associated with the card was in Virginia, and he left Virginia years ago. He didn't leave a forwarding address. Additionally, the number he used for registration was Centerplate's number, the food court service company. Even though his case is becoming stronger, it wasn't enough evidence to subpoena the credit card company to get more information. Just based on Mike's demeanor, it seems like he's done it many times before. Centerplate would be the perfect job for a serial rapist. This job allowed them to have all their expenses paid. They wouldn't need to put down any private information for hotel bookings or transportation. Additionally, it allowed them to travel to different cities, and this can prevent investigators from connecting the assaults. Ken Googled Centerplate's competitors. He started calling to see if Mike was employed there. One by one, he crossed off the competitors. He called Ovation and gave a description of Mike. They responded that due to privacy issues, they required a subpoena. At this moment, Ken knew he was in the right place. All the other companies quickly checked their database and told him, no, what does Ovation have to hide? Ken reached out to the Miami Police Department, and a few hours later, the subpoena was served to Ovation. And of course, Ovation had an employee with the same description with the name of Michael Lee Jones. His current job assignment was in Frederick, Maryland. Detectives traveled to Harry Grover Stadium in Frederick, Maryland. At the time it seemed like a long shot because they still didn't have concrete evidence that Michael was the perpetrator. But since the case had gone cold for almost a year, it was their best lead, so they called Mike to make sure that he would be available to speak in person. There weren't any specifics given during the phone call. They just wanted to talk about an incident that happened in Miami around the time of the boat show. Since he worked there, they have a few questions. Again, his demeanor on the phone was calm and very polite. It did seem like he was trying to give them as much information to catch the rape. When detectives met with Mike, they were intimated by how massive he was, but his mannerisms were very soft and gentle, opposite of his physique. Detectives asked Mike if he met up with anyone in Miami. Mike said he hooked up with someone once. He was asked to describe the women, and Mike simply replied, "I only have sex with white women." Detectives dug deeper and asked Mike if he had any relationship with anyone at the airport Regency. Mike denies having sex with anyone there. He said the woman he had sex with was a worker at the boat show and they didn't hook up in the hotel. Mike was asked if the woman was blonde, and he said she was not, and he had sex with a German woman. At this point, they were convinced that Mike was not the suspect. Mike was friendly and seemed forthcoming with his answers. Before leaving, they asked Mike to take a DNA test. Mike agreed, making the detectives feel like the trip was a waste of time because if he was guilty, why volunteer his DNA? Mike's DNA was obtained and sent to the lab for sequencing. Months later, the DNA result came back, and it was a perfect match. Shortly after, Mike was charged with raping, kidnapping, and assault. He denied all the charges during the interrogation. He would protest, but never got angry. Eventually, after the police told him his DNA matched the DNA found on Inna, Mike admitted to having sex with Inna. He said that he thought she was a hooker and paid her a few hundred after they finished, and she was not harmed, but just very drunk. When the interrogators showed Inna's bruised face and body, Mike said, "I did not hurt that girl. I'm not violent. I never hit a woman in my whole life. I'm not going to hurt her." When the detective asked about why he had taken his suitcase to the parking lot at 5 a.m., days before his checkout date, Mike said that he couldn't remember if he was leaving that day or the next day. They asked about the contents of his suitcase. Mike said he only had clothes, shoes, and video games. The detective was able to trip him up by stating that the suitcase must have been heavy, since Mike had to use both hands to tug the wheel of the suitcase. Mike said he had tons of books in the suitcase as well. He carried lots of books because he really liked reading. When asked to name a book, Mike was not able to, not even one. Detectives theorized that after assaulting Inna in his room, he shoved her into his suitcase and transported her out of the hotel. He drove off at 5:31 a.m. It's possible that Mike dumped Inna's body and came back to the hotel at about 6:21 a.m. He then went to get breakfast at the hotel restaurant at 7:59 a.m. This was plenty of time to make it to his shift at the boat show. This isn't a shut-and-done case. There were still some holes to fully convict Mike. Although the DNA was his, it doesn't prove that it was consensual or they couldn't recover any evidence from Mike's room since it has been cleaned and new guests stayed in that room. Because Mike was so forthcoming with his answers and DNA, it definitely helped him look less guilty. Additionally, Inna's statements and memory were incredibly unreliable. Even though she was able to pick Mike from a photo lineup of potential suspects, it could be that she saw Mike in the elevator and made his face familiar. Mike settled with prosecutors since they didn't have concrete evidence. Mike pled guilty to one count of sexual battery with a weapon and aggravated battery. All his other severe charges were dropped. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison. The police had a hunch that he was a serial. They ran his DNA through a database with over 8 million offender profiles. He must have had other victims. Many months later, in late 2006, there were 3 incidents that matched his DNA. This was how Inna's case solved 3 other assault cases. The first victim was in Colorado Springs. Just like Inna, the victim had blonde hair. Her name was Jennifer Roessler. She was 41 years old. Jennifer was leaving a convenience store and walked alone around 2:30 a.m. She was offered a ride by a large black man with glasses on December 1st, 2005. Eventually, Jennifer trusted him enough and allowed him into her apartment to get a glass of water. After she asked him to leave, that is where Mike took advantage of her. He covered her mouth with his hand as he assaulted her. Some sources say that since Jennifer let him into her apartment, it is possible that the sex was consensual. With no leads, the case went cold even with DNA evidence. Coincidentally, Mike was working the concessions at the Colorado Springs World Arena. It was only 2 years later that they were able to link the DNA collected to Mike. The next 2 victims were in New Orleans. One of them had blonde hair and was partying at the French Quarter. She was visibly drunk. As she tried getting a cab, a car swerved in front of her, offering her a free ride. Again, the victim described the driver as a big black man with glasses. He kept her in the parking lot. Similar to the Colorado Springs victim, Mike covered her face, but she bit him so hard she could feel parts of his skin on her teeth. He then dumped her onto the parking lot. She reported the assault. Semen and DNA from her teeth was collected. The case was finally solved when the specimen was a match to Michael Lee Jones. The second New Orleans victim was Lorraine Gautreaux. Like the other victims, she was raped by a man who offered her a ride. As she was walking down the street, he picked her up and shoved her into his car. He pinned her down with all his weight and shoved a knife against her throat. He threatened her that if she went to the police, he would find her and kill her. He wasn't yelling or being frantic. He was calm and collected. It was at this moment that Lorraine knew he did this before. Detectives were able to trace that Mike had been in both states when the assault happened. In 2008, the Colorado Springs trial for Jennifer Roessler was about to begin, but unfortunately, she passed due to another unrelated crime. This means that there is no victim to stand trial. They had to rely on Inna and the New Orleans victim's testimony. Their main evidence was the matching DNA and Jones' similar method of assault. It was all too similar to each other. The New Orleans victim, who will be referred to as Rachel, proved to be an incredible help to the case, even though the assault for her was almost 6 years ago. She was able to describe exactly what happened to her. As Rachel was leaving the New Orleans Jazz Fest in May 2003, she was looking for a cab near Esplanade Avenue and Burgundy Street. A man offered her a ride, then took her to an isolated area and assaulted her. A crucial piece of evidence that propelled this case was the composite sketch she made with the police. It looked almost identical to Mike. Unfortunately, Inna's testament was unhelpful and almost damaging to the case. She wasn't able to explain why she had different stories when she spoke with the police. She struggled with English and things were lost in translation, making her statements on stand confusing. Mike did not testify and pleaded not guilty to all charges in the Colorado case. His lawyer reasoned that it was consensual and that Mike thought she was a prostitute. There was too many similarities. Jurors in Colorado believed the 3 women. They took into account that 3 different women in different states at different times accused the same man of after engaging in consensual sex work. There was no evidence to suggest that any of the victims were sex workers. And then there was the undeniable evidence the DNA. Michael Lee Jones was charged with sexual assault and felonious sexual contact. He would be behind bars for 24 years to life for sexual assault with force and 12 years to life for felonious sexual contact. At the time, he was 38 years old, and his first parole hearing will be in 2032. Inner received $300,000 from the hotel and the hotel's security company in a settlement. If you think this case was interesting, subscribe because I will be covering another case about a burn victim who solved her own murder.